Hello and welcome to Varn Vlog. And today we have a panel to keep me from fighting with the audience. Um, and we are talking about all that is bad. Um, so we are going to be speaking about the craziness of the election, how I keep on making solo videos and have to re-record them every 35 seconds because something even dumber happens. And why do we even give a shit about what the Democratic Party is doing right now? We're going to open it up to the panel, then to the general audience. Go.
Well,
We are
is
live.
it fair to say that I don't really give a shit what the Democratic Party is doing? I mean, to answer the question.
I'm glad you are not giving a shit. And anyone else want to comment on this?
I have been so checked out of this thing. I only pop in on when something hilarious or amazing happens. You know, being invested in this sort of thing really requires it to feel like there's stakes, and it feels like there needs to be some sort of effort being put forward by all the parties involved. And at this point, there's just bigger fish to fry. Like, there's a strike happening on my campus. Like, the University of Chicago police arrested picketers. Most of my coworkers, except for the real weirdos, don't seem to be talking about this stuff, in any real meaningful way, which is a not the usual situation when it comes to these things.
So, I think most of us find the current situation, if nothing else, funny. I go ahead.
Something really funny did happen today. So Biden has total dementia. It's not even sundowners anymore. He was at some event and he thought some other lady was his wife and he went up and sniffed her. And then Jill ran up and was like, no, 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 and pulled him away. I saw the video like 5 times.
Okay.
I mean, I remember in 2016, I had some coworkers who thought that everything that was going down in 2016 was really hilarious. And I didn't get the humor at the time. I don't know if they really did either, like in a real, meaningful way. They just seemed very online, but in a, cruising really weird Reddit kind of way. And this time around, it's just it's both I find it very both funny and horrifying in a way that I didn't before. Like, I didn't get the humor last time. This time I definitely see the humor, but I also feel like if you care at all about just body counts and the general direction of a society, and you have any responsibilities for other people, like children or elders, this never ends well for regular people. I kind of feel like, though there's entirely possible nothing terrible really happens, but it feels like it's a lot closer to being real than not. I don't know.
So we got a question. Could Trump be president be a good thing? It feels like things will just economically get worse. I'll just put this up there. And we seem to be moving towards more wars. Wouldn't that maybe invalidate their leadership? Here's the thing with Trump and good or bad. Trump is a demagogue. You can go to a Trump speech and hear anything you want to hear in it. It's like a Rorschach test for what conservative faction that you're in. What that proves is that the bureaucrats and functionaries of the general state, whatever their department, have totally failed on messaging and have no coherent response to anything because they can't call it out. And they can't call it out Not because there isn't something to call out. It's not like everyone doesn't see that all the emperors have no fucking clothes. I mean, except the most banal of us. It's that if they do call it out, they have to answer for the shit they've normalized, from immigration across the board. There's been no movement on any left issue from 2016 to 2020. The things we've been promised, even during the administration, have not come to pass. And the media, by and large, are shills towards the Democratic Party, except for the ones that are shills towards the Republicans. But those get called out all the time. We know who they are, from Fox News to OWN. The bigger issue is, what does an independent political project look like? Because right now that seems to be the biggest issue at hand. And what do we do with that? There doesn't seem to be a lot of movement towards building working class institutions that don't try to tail anything. The moment someone tries to break off from the Democrats, their immediate ingrained impulse is to tell somebody else, because they're lazy. Like, across the board, most of the sectarian organizations, most of the Democratic unionists, etc., are effectively lazy. They can't imagine building anything for themselves because they don't want to be called out for lacking the skills to do it. And I'm going to turn this over to the panel and the audience, because otherwise they're going to start ranting.
Well, I think that ship sailed.
I have to agree that, like, there's that good, like, there's just different flavors of bad on the horizon in terms of the kind of like state politics that we're going to be seeing coming towards us. You know, I don't believe that, like, there's a meaningful difference, and like there are certain things that I feel like a Trump presidency, I feel like, is going to be a honeypot for a lot of really like psychotic far right people who will be chewed up and spit out. A certain percentage of those people won't be chewed up and spit out, and they'll be marginally effective. I was just talking with a friend today about how we all remember, like, we're old enough to remember, Bush and Cheney, and how effective Dick Cheney was at pulling the levers of government power when we were young, and how legitimately terrifying that was. I personally, like, got, had my job threatened by the FBI in 2002 for my activism and organizing. Nothing like that really happened under Trump, not because I don't think that they wouldn't if they had the chance, but it was aspects of the state were kind of like at war with each other by the end. And like there wasn't a Cheney figure who Trump was willing to kind of let steer the ship of state. And, so in a certain sense, I could see that, I don't know, being positive, but I also don't know that that's positive. I just know that that's like one thing I foresee potentially happening at this point with, the Democrats. I don't know what their potential for victory is unless they do something like so far out of the box. I just can't imagine them doing it. And that throws them into chaos because, I think they've just really built, their party around the idea of just kind of like, we're just, stewards of or caretakers of like the status quo. And they've done everything in their power to eliminate any realistic threats to that from inside the party. And so, like, I just don't know, man. I don't know what's good, what's bad. I don't think it matters. It's just going to suck either way. And so I refuse to get that invested in it. Besides, like, chuckling over bullshit and, just kind of like, whatever, man.
Well, this actually opens up a fundamental question for me. I haven't given a shit about the presidency since Barack Obama's first term. And yet, I don't see people really building a political strategy that isn't caught up in the media cycle, even if it's saying it doesn't matter. Watching people maintain their presence and not getting sucked into tailing somebody seems to be impossible. And I kind of want to know why that is. Like, why can't people say, okay, we're just going to try to build institutions outside of this state apparatus? Not that we're anarchists. I mean, some of us are, but I'm not. But like, we're not even trying that. I know some of it comes from the fact that a lot of strategies that were adopted from 2018 to 2021 were exhausting. They were exhausting. They were under extenuated circumstances. Dual power and mutual aid enabled a lot of stuff to happen, but people couldn't keep on pushing into it because they weren't being institutionalized. We have seen a lot of union militancy the last 15, 20 years, but it hasn't been reflected in union growth at all. And yet, if you were to read both left and liberal media, you would think that the unions were exploding between 2019 and 2022. And this is our Owl of Minerva shit, because the actual growth in unions was actually in 2010 to 2013, and no one took advantage of it. And I see very little people going into the Bureau of Labor Statistics and looking at what the data actually says, including the unions themselves, because a lot of them have so many property holdings that they have very little incentive to need to grow. They're surviving off the potential valuation of their property. There are many sectarian organizations that do the same thing. The CPUSA is worth a lot of money because it has historical buildings that are left over from the 1920s. Like, they can't valorize it, they can't really do much with it, but they theoretically on paper have it, and that gives them a sense of false security right now. There's a lot of that because of the valuation of property, and people don't look at the way this affects things downstream on the left. Why are your institutions so sporadic? They have no reason not to be. And there's no skin for them in the game. They don't need to grow. I mean, unions on paper don't seem to be that concerned about actual growth, except for unions in dying industries. I mean, it does seem to be specific that the UAW is where we see the most militant unions, because in some ways, if they drop the protectionism that keeps Chinese cars out of this country, the UAW is gone. And I don't know why we don't talk about this shit honestly, but we don't. Instead, I hear people from the DSA's right wing. I mean, they're on the socialist spectrum. I'm not calling them Republicans, people, before you get mad. Tell me that, like, Biden's tinkering around the National Labor Relations Board is somehow going to really radicalize union movements, when every statistic indicates it's done jacking shit. All right. And we have this question. Unions are popular for the first time in about a generation and a half, and yet they are not growing as a percentage of the population. So is it just because the people who like them don't have fucking jobs? I don't know. But we need to talk about this more honestly, instead of thinking we can ride some party's dick up into some power situation where we can split them later, be it the Democrats, a la the dirty break or whatever that dumb bullshit was, or the Republicans, and I don't even know how they think that's going to be done. I literally have people who sincerely believe, on both the left and the right, that we're going to live under a pro-labor administration where Republicans are passing laws to limit labor unions in the Southeast, and no one's fucking talking about it. It stopped Sean Fain in his goddamn tracks, and I haven't heard that much about it at all, except from normal, wonky liberal media. So are people just huffing their own fumes? What's going on here? And I'm going to turn it over to the panel and to the audience. So fill the dead air. Julie, do you have something to say about that? I do, but I want to hear what you guys say first.
I think the unions themselves are allergic to organizing. I think that strangely, right, like the capitalists don't really know the power of the workers because they've forgotten, right? Because there hasn't been labor activity in decades. Um, but the unions know how powerful the workers are. And I think that the unions are actually afraid of the workers and their power.
I think workers or that unions are definitely afraid of rank and file rebellion, because rank and file rebellion in the like in organized workplaces puts the existing legal and financial structures of like unions at risk um, through lawsuits and unfair labor practices. Um, and so I think that like from someone who's pretty like involved inside of labor reform work and that sort of thing, we just recently had Jane McCavery die from cancer, and watching um, various people from the right wing of the, I'd say the liberal left. I'll just call them the liberal left at this point. Writing their obituaries, getting published by Labor Notes, which is supposed to be a rank and file advocate of rank and file democracy. And a thing that I've been thinking about that I feel like is missing from this like the discussion around like the reinvigoration of labor, or workers moving on to take more effective strike action. It's like Jane McCavery did kind of embody a certain sort of reinvigoration of things like strikes and organizing inside of particular unions, and that was really important. But if you read her work, you could read it in a way that was, very like focused on valorizing the kind of like the heroic staffer. And so I really believe, I think that people get very focused on things like the DSA getting behind the squad and like these, various elected Democrat people as being like this really kind of false start, big mistake, not good. But I believe that the real damage that happened is that a lot of those similar, like sane people or people in that tendency in the American left decided to, go get jobs as union staffers. And I have run into these people repeatedly who will call themselves Labor Notes. I'm a Labor Notes like unionist. And these are people who ventriloquize workers, who ignore or trample, worker democracy inside of unions. People who are willing to chalk up superficial wins during bargaining campaigns, and kind of like they understand being organized is important, and I think that they grasp some key points that McCavery made about organizing and organization, lessons that I feel like the left wing of whatever is like the labor, that the same kind of tendency of the left moving into labor don't seem to grasp as much. But then they also miss key things that McCavery said, which is like you always have to be listening to workers. You're always looking for organic leaders. These are people who like, labor is important because workers are supposed to be the motors of history. And so I really feel like the real lasting damage that has kind of come about from this recent, like the resurgent and now like receding left in America, has been a reinvigoration of the liberal unionism that was really focused on, we're getting into unions because we want to we want people in unions to be advocating for basic liberal reforms that have been on the table for the last 40-50 years and not really gone anywhere. We want to try and get Bernie Sanders endorsements from unions. And I've seen it in my own union endorsing our local social democratic, guy, Brandon Johnson, over the strenuous objection of nurses who basically watched Brandon Johnson refuse to return their fucking calls all during the pandemic. And as our social safety net hospitals were being basically all these nurses were, I call it like a shadow layoff. And so this is where I see the entire left. I was literally in a CPUSA office last weekend doing a street medic training with my street medic collective and listening to one of these newer CPUSA members talking about how, if we just had, 100 of this, we had a mutual friend who just joined CPUSA. She's a really strong organizer, very enthusiastic. It's like, if we just had like 100 people like her, we could be just as strong as we were 50 years ago. I'm like, 50 years ago, like the 1970s? Like, what are you talking about? He's like, well, that's like the last time CPUSA ran a presidential candidate. And I'm like, well, if you think running a presidential candidate is the strongest the CPUSA, the best the CPUSA has been able to do, I mean, just look at your own history. Like I said, I was like, I really think that the biggest impact CPUSA ever had was in the labor movement. And you can read those histories, and it's very different from this orientation towards constantly focusing on trying to get politicians elected who are at best, kind of like a protest. So I don't know, I've talked a lot, but this is kind of where I'm at when it comes to this kind of like independent stuff and what's going wrong with the labor movement is that I think we've seen a reinvigoration of like the liberal wing of labor. They are more organized and more focused on organizing internally than the left of labor. And I think the left of labor continues to kind of stake out these kind of like ultra left. And I say that very like, I hate that term because I don't really think that it's used the right way by most people. That they're like, well, like union, like, I like listening to Antifada and Sean KB. He's got a big podcast and he's talking about his independent labor clubs and stuff. And it's like, but they're like, because the existing unions are dead and not a place for us to do anything productive. If people from that perspective would actually come in and do the shit that we need to do, maybe it would be a little less like, maybe we could contest it more. I don't know. I'm always a little on the optimistic side of what's possible, but at the same time, it is very difficult when you're watching liberals be the only people who take these institutions kind of seriously, and the left doesn't seem to be that interested in it. Oh, hey, I'm like, you're not like speaking, or you're speaking and we're not hearing you, Derek.
For those of you who don't know, he's referring to the period of the CPUSA where they were organizing the TUEL, the TUUL, and then the early CIO. Which is actually during third periodism, which was a disaster for Europe, but it was good for the United States because we have different constitutional structures. The US, all the debates about the Popular Front versus the United Front fundamentally misunderstands the structure of the US government as written in the Constitution. Those are invented for parliamentary systems. We do not have a parliamentary system. And that's the first thing you have to deal with. Secondly, to pick up on a little bit of the pessimism right now, I feel like a lot of people are taking council communist positions, which is we don't work with any unions as they currently exist. And I get the need for external union activism. I get the need for independent labor clubs and stuff like that. I think those things are important, but when you forego the unions that actually exist, you tend to replace them with nothing. All right. And there are different incentives for the unions. The union bosses are a problem. There's no denying that. If you've ever been in a union and you don't understand that, then that's kind of a shrug. The focus on lobbying, which has been the predominant focus of labor union political action for a long time, is also a problem. I do not see why unions are endorsing national candidates in this fucking environment at all. I don't get it. I don't understand it. Every promise you get from either one of them has been false. And a lot of the laws that actually govern most of the unions that most people exist in are state level laws anyway. There are so many exemptions to the National Labor Relations Act that people just kind of learned about because of the railroad strike. But there are more people in unions that are not subject to the NCLA than people who are. All right. And that hasn't gone through people's thick skulls. Furthermore, union expansion has avoided confronting franchises just across the board in both the services, but also in things like, why didn't the UAW try to expand into things like auto shops? That's a huge sector. It is larger than the industrial sector. But the reason why they can't is each one of those is an independent contract. All right. Starbucks is a corporation. You can get corporate shop contracts, even though they're going to try to break them down into individual shops of like 16 to 24 people. But there is a way to go about that. But if you try to unionize McDonald's, you have to deal with the fact that your contracts are with a panoply of different owners, even in the same state, much less at the national level. One of the side effects of neoliberalism that my friend Nicolas Villarreal has written about is that it returned petite bourgeoisification to large sectors of the economy. And petite bourgeois enterprises are hard to unionize, and they're not that profitable, which makes unionization gains even harder, because if you actually do succeed, you can collapse the business because there's no economy of scale. All right, I'm going to answer a statement here that I think is kind of true, but not entirely true. American unions are patterned on the model of fascist Italy, sort of. So, of course, they are politically inert. The difference is Taft-Hartley actually makes some of the union advantages that the fascists gave not possible. Sectoral union contracts are illegal in the United States, as is actual worker ownership. Like, I, as a worker, can own stock in a company, but we can't own the company in a lot of cases unless we're in certain states with certain co-op laws. It's literally illegal. So these are things that the left in America just do not deal with. Okay, we have another statement I want to deal with. If the NLRA is scrapped or gutted to irrelevance, effectively back to 1920s for labor relations, would that necessarily be the worst thing in the medium run? I don't know. It would scramble everyone's strategies because they have hidden behind official union recognition for a long time.
You would have like there would be certain states that have passed certain laws that would basically become the law for workers in those states. But then you would also have, and then contract law supersedes any law. Like your contract, like if you are in a state where having a union is illegal, like in a public sector, but you're well enough organized and can withstand all the things that like they would throw at you, you can bargain a contract outside of the law, and that contract is binding in a way that it doesn't matter what the actual law is of the land. Now, that doesn't mean that is incredibly difficult and it's incredibly hard, and you have to be very motivated to get those sorts of things. And in the past, people have been able to do that. It's just, when we talk about things like franchises, there are ways to solve those problems. It just requires that the unions with resources dedicate them to that, or the workers who are organizing in those things start thinking outside the box and probably start really thinking outside of the law. And, we're going to come to a point where I also don't want to say like it's good or bad if the NLRA is scrapped. I think that if the NLRA is scrapped, most unions don't have a plan for that, and that will not be good. Like, that will be probably pretty drastically terrible for most of the workers. When I seem to recall Wisconsin, like, basically banned most public sector bargaining. That was not good for the workers of Wisconsin. But they got to that point because the unions as they existed just refused to recognize what was coming right at them. Right.
The entire Southeast has banned public sector bargaining for the entirety of my lifetime, except for Florida, and we've seen how weak that is. Florida has some of the working conditions in Georgia where any sort of public sector bargaining is outright illegal. And in fact, we cannot call ourselves a union. When I was in Georgia, you could join the association, and there were two. And if you joined the national one, you were a fucking moron because it didn't do anything. You were just giving money to the NEA there, and it had no repercussions even on local lobbying. We had our own separate organization called SAGE, which was a more effective lobbyist, but they had to play with Republicans. There was no way around it. So, and they played with Dixiecrats before that. That's what they did. They were good at it. And they actually got us better contracts. And one of the most unfortunate truths of my lifetime is my contract was better in a non-union state than now that I'm in a union state where the union is not aggressive. All right. Now that doesn't reflect on the national because the NEA it's highly individual from state to state. In fact, it's governed by 50 different sets of laws. And that's true for the AFT too. The AFT, however, is more invested in the Democratic Party apparatus than even the NEA is. So, and we're a public sector union. We have different concerns. But we've seen, for example, when Sean Fain went to the Southeast and they started having some gains for the first time, we saw the laws change by the GOP and there was nothing said about it. So if people buy this current pro-worker posturing from either party, I'm not being selective here. If Bernie Sanders tells me they're going to pass the PRO Act one more fucking time, I'm going to throw my screen across the room because they're lying. They have never done it. They're never gonna fucking do it. And the only way we could do that is if we would go after not just the center, but the quote electeds that we have put in place to represent us, all 6 plus 1 of them, 6 in the House and 1 in the Senate. And I don't know why we put our faith in these people, but I keep on being told it's pragmatic from both leftist and from labor organizers, and yet they get not a goddamn thing for it, and they're wondering why they're losing right now. I mean, yes, Biden's situation, I mean, this is particularly farcical that you put someone who was never particularly competent and lost the presidential election twice in my lifetime before now as the main candidate because all the backbench were Nepo babies who couldn't do a goddamn thing. That you ended up in this situation with a boomer who is sundowning and has never been a particularly good retail politician, representing a party that literally has no imagination and largely codified Trump policies in the past anyway. And for people who said, oh, we're not going to normalize it, you fucking did. Now, for most of my audience, I'm not talking to you guys because you didn't do that, but you often collaborate with people who do. Why do we care? Like, why am I being made to care about this farce of an election? I mean, this is the biggest farce ever. And for those of you who don't get the counter messaging, there's 2 things that are obvious. One, The Democratic Party likes the fact that if everything becomes federalized, it can scare people to voting for it in cities and red states. And two, so they have no incentive to fix any of the structural problems from the Roe v. Wade reversal on down. But the other issue, and the one that's kind of apparent to me right now, is that they also quietly normalize everything. They just do it in a way that gets the administrative apparatus on board. So all these people who are arguing even on the left, that we should be risking our political capital to defend the administrative state, when it's already the right of the GOP to put anyone there that they want to. The only thing preventing it is norms. It's not a fucking coup. It's perfectly legal.
I will say that it's really telling how strategically bereft the left liberals in the Democratic Party are when they have hitched themselves to Joe Biden, and we are potentially on the eve of Biden stepping down from the ticket and getting someone like Kamala Harris. And so they just put all their eggs in the Biden basket. And now we're going to end up like potentially, I don't know. It's all very, there's so much pressure being put on more pressure than I've seen in my entire lifetime for someone who's on who's been basically anointed to, to be the candidate to step aside. And, for the Bernie and the AOCs to have come out publicly, like AOC literally getting out there and being like, if you're not on Team Biden, retire. This is all going to come. I feel like we're watching something winding up, and it's going to be very amusing when that all when that actually like springs, if it does spring one way or the other, it's gonna look like shit for anyone who was on that train.
But I don't think AOC is on the left anymore.
Oh no, yeah. I call them left liberals because they're liberals, and they're to the left of of liberalism, and what they are doing is pushing forward a reform agenda that's been on that's been their agenda since like the 80s, and they don't seem to be able to move it forward. And there's still plenty of people who consider themselves socialists who, are willing to go to bat for these people and who will accuse anyone who isn't ready to go to bat for them of being on the ultra left or, sort of like, unrealistic, unpragmatic. And so I think that this is just like, I feel comfortable calling those people left liberals at this point because that's what they are.
Well, there's a lot to answer for. I mean, one of the things that we have in the United States right now and on the left that's a problem is we have been reinvigorated by foreign policy. Foreign policy is the least, and I've said this over and over and over again, democratically responsive area of the government. It has been systematically, even by accident, moved into the area that is more and more in the administrative state. This started with the police power, with the treaty actually with the UN. It was expanded actually, ironically, with the Police Powers Act, which was supposed to limit the power of the presidency, but actually set up a way for the presidency to involve American troops in such a way that you can't do anything about it, or to involve American funding in such a way that you can't do anything about it because it is outside most anything that you tax and spend upon. Now, you can't get Republicans to care about this as much as they're losing shit about people getting unfair student loan forgiveness, which, by the way, was never an answer to the student loan problem. It is a temporary one-off fix. It fixes nothing in the long term. It is basically just trying to con people into not reforming an area because they can't get a goddamn thing through Congress. But we've seen this expansion of legal power under conservative judiciary that no matter what they say in the executive on how they're going to empower the workers from the GOP, they're lying. And they're lying because they don't have the power to do it either. They have already ceded it to the judiciary. And I don't know that the judiciary actually is going to take the formal GOP stance, because I don't know that the public stance of the GOP it is any more real than the public stance of the Democrats. But the one thing that I keep on being frustrated with is when I say this, people are like, oh, you're telling people to vote for a third party. No, I'm not. There's no third party in America that has built the institutional apparatus or has the support to meaningfully change shit. We need one, but you can't throw a Hail Mary executive run for the presidency as a way to build a fucking party. That is not how it works. In so much that it's ever worked, and the last time we had a major party shift in the United States, I will remind you, took a goddamn civil war. Even if that was true, you would have to build a lot of other institutions to do that. And no one wants to do it because it's fucking hard. The problem that I have right now with everybody in this goddamn country is that everyone is promising everything with no sacrifices, time scale, or anything at all. Like you're not going to do anything in 2 years in the United States. It's a fucking mess of a klug. It's going to take years and years and years to untangle some of this shit unless the courts do it, and then it's going to collapse. So building para-institutions would require a long-term time frame. Now, the right has built para-institutions over the course of literally 80 years, and it can't keep its shit together, and we've done none of that. So I don't know what people expect. I mean, that you might call the DSA being such a para-institution, but like, it can't fund itself correctly. Like, it's the largest socialist organization in America, has somewhere between 60K and 100K members, depending on who you ask and what day you're looking and whether or not we're counting all the paper members. And yet it is very close to bankrupt. All right. There are sects that have 4,000 to 5,000 people that are more fiscally solvent than the DSA. But it's because I think they're afraid if they actually asked any real commitments from members, even, I'm not just talking about dues, like serious commitments, disciplinary commitments, that it would fall apart. And I think that's kind of known. The reason why the DSA grew was because it was actually a fractured organization that had no program and no real appeal, that tailed other things and had some frankly rich Nepo baby publishers who got on its wave in 2011, 2012, given the panoply of other sects they could pick from. There were other ones floated. People talked about it with the IWW, but the IWW had too many internal issues at the time. And we have people with 4 to 8 year memory spans, so they don't even know this stuff. It's not that old. I was 32 when some of this stuff was talked about. I'm 43 now, and this institutional memory is already gone. And while we talk about like the decline in DSA members, the DSA recruits kids all the time to replace people, so we have no idea what their churn is. All right. So if you think about it, since they're constantly recruiting from college students, and let's say they've declined 20K members, they've actually lost more than that because they're still recruiting constantly. So it's just a churn. I meet more ex-DSA members than DSA members on any given day. And that's the largest left institution in America. All right. Now, when people say I was reading someone's like, you could do it, you could act like France. Well, how? There's no way to build electoral coalitions like that in the United States. If you enter the Democratic Party, you are subject to the Democratic Party donor base. And there's no way the DSA or the Justice Democrats or any one of those NGO-like organizations can compete with that. I was looking at DSA grants to candidates to get them started even at the city level. It's like $7,000. There was a $250,000 city council election here in Salt Lake City, which is not a major metropolitan area. How in the blue fuck is $7,000 going to do a goddamn thing? So it's just the pragmatic electoral matter doesn't deal with the realities and expense of electoral politics. And that's not even dealing with the fact that the DSA has a professional apparatus attached to it that is really large. I mean, and is not necessarily responsive to even its political leadership. And its political leadership all comes from sectarian caucus organizations that develop because there's no regional coordination in the DSA. If anyone thought about the structure of this organization for 30 fucking seconds, they would see it was a disaster that was designed not to really work and practically moves money from a lot of areas diffused throughout the United States into the two richest metropoles in the country, LA and New York. That's its primary function. 80% of every dollar that goes into the dues goes into the national. The national's base is in the two most democratic parts of the country and major metropolitan areas that are already well off compared to the rest. Why on earth would people invest in that in the long run? And I haven't even seen the people who want to reform the DSA really talk about these structural things. And if they do, they're not making it known to the public. I'm not saying there's no one in it talking about it. Now, if that's the best we have, then you got fucking nothing. All right. You have some other organizations, like I said, that own so much land that from legacy that they could probably have no membership and still be solvent for a generation and a half. But what are you going to do with that? And people are attracted to these now because they want legacy names. They want something that historically did something in the past. It's hauntology all the way around. You know, if you want to beat off to 1917 and pretend you live in a country with massive amounts of peasantry, go ahead. But I don't see the fucking point. You don't. Even if you thought that agrarian workers were the equivalent of peasants, which they're not, they're like 2 to 5% of the entire economy. All right. You want to do blue collar industrial workers, a strategy that has literally never worked in the history of ever. It has failed. And every place it's been tried, the industrial blue collar economy is 15% of the US economy. That's it. Now we have these nebulous categories like PMC, which people who are PMC really obsessed with because they dislike the people that they work with. And I get it. They suck. I understand. Professionals are hard to deal with. I don't like them either. All right. And they do infect everything with their icky bureaucratic nonsense. But if you include all college attendees in that category and you bracket out people under 55, that is 60% of the population or more. All right. Now, if you look at BA havers, it's 40%. But that is still, I don't know. Let's do some basic math. 15 times 2 is 30, plus another half of that is 40. That's the difference in size of the population. Now, you might go, well, that's why we have to rely on the third world. You're literally asking people who are they're not even proletarianized in a lot of these cases. They're kind of lumpenized to come up and fight the largest military apparatus the world has ever known, and they can do it to defend their own land, but they're not going to liberate you. Because they would die instantly. War changes the moment you try to move from defense to invasion, and when you actually have to take ground versus just survive. Now, I'm not even going to get about leftists who talk all about war, who haven't read a basic book on war strategy and don't know a goddamn thing they're talking about. But then again, it seems like a lot of political leaders these days don't either. So I don't know why I would just get mad at leftists for that. But it does seem to me that there's a lot of hopes that are just projections. All right. And I personally do not feel good selling people bullshit. And I'm kind of tired of Nepo babies and people with Ivy League degrees that I've known and met and can sometimes dance circles around. I'm from a fucking state school. All right. I went to a mid-tier public school and I come from nowhere and I can dance around some of these people. And this is also why I get mad when people are like, oh, Varn, talk to the workers. They don't understand your big words.
I mean, talk to some workers yourself.
Yeah. You're like, you don't think these people can read? Now, maybe if they're under 35, most of them can't, but that includes fucking college attendees, so I don't know what you're fucking talking about. Anyway, turning this over to the panel before I get mad.
Well, I've been spending a lot of time canvassing lately. And one thing I've noticed, I don't think you'll disagree with me, is that people are really dumb. And I think that if the left wants to build power, the left has to figure out how to appeal to dumb people. It's not their fault that they're dumb. Like, I was talking to this one guy, he just had a heart of gold. And I was like, look, dude, you got to sign my petition to increase the minimum wage. And he was like, well, I don't think I should do that because I got to check with my union first. And I was like, okay. I mean, I couldn't even argue with him at that point. I was like, all right, he knows he's dumb and he's going to ask his union for advice. But most people on the left, I mean, the things that they're arguing about and the things they're talking about have absolutely no impact on an average working person's life. And I'm not saying, Varn, that you should talk to workers, because I don't think that's, really what you enjoy doing or what you're meant to do. But somebody has to talk to the workers. Somebody has to organize the workers, and that has to happen before anything else happens.
To go a little bit about that, when we talk about dumb, all right, I don't think people in general are dumb. I do think they're undereducated, but we have to ask themselves, what are their incentives to know any goddamn thing? Like, anywhere in our society, where are their incentives to know anything? Like, they are told bullshit about the technology they work. I literally hold an engineer told me technology doubles every 2 years. No, it doesn't. It does not. Technology is not, we have not seen technological growth in most areas of society in over a generation. We've seen technological growth that has side effects in other areas, called this in one, and most of that is before 2010. Even AI, large language learning models, is based on technologies that's been around for a long time. Now, that's always true. There's always 20 years of development before something goes live, but I've heard about all sorts of tech that we've just dropped. So we have to ask ourselves, why are people incentivized to be dumb? And I think this is my point about tainter. When you have an over-complex system where you need to know one thing well, but that's all you need to know, why the fuck would you invest a lot of time knowing a bunch of other stuff when you cannot benefit from it? That doesn't mean you're stupid. That's actually a rational decision.
No, I think your argument holds, but I just think that, I mean, we're not talking about the millions of people in this country who have brain damage from lead poisoning. I mean, like, I don't know if it's just because I live in an industrial hellhole, but yeah, I mean, what I mean is, like, I talk to people and I find it shocking that I just don't think they're very intelligent. And I think that we spend a lot of our time talking to people that are average intelligence and forget how many people are of, like, below average intelligence.
Well, I mean, go ahead.
Hold on. So, as a person who takes care of working people all the time, like, that, being able to communicate to people at all kinds of levels is just like a requirement for my job to be effective as a nurse. And my general sense is I share Varn's take on this, is that people are, like, very much not incentivized to use, like, personally, I believe every person has the capacity to be, to critically think. I think that's, like, a key part of, like, human intelligence. I think the difference between, low intelligence versus high intelligence people is actually probably a lot narrower than most people would, like, imagine, outside of, like, very far outliers.
It's a standard deviation. That's
right.
like in IQ points. If you think those are valid, that's like 7 to 10 IQ points. That's it.
Right. And so when I'm talking, so my general sense is that people are very incoherent. I run into people who are, same level of education as I am, who are working in, highly technically, demanding jobs, who are, and I'm like, this goes for people who are, teaching like medicine at the elite institution I work for, including them, as well as people like at every level, like the housekeepers, the nurses, everybody. I find the vast majority of people are highly incoherent when it comes to how they kind of like interpret what's going on in the world. Um, I think that there's a lot of reasons for that. I think that we're in a very large, empire, and when you happen to be in a very large empire, and I include countries like Russia, China, Brazil, you tend when you walk and when you talk to people from the middle of those countries, they tend to not think very much about anything that's going on outside of their country. Um, I think that's especially so in the United States. Like it is the most true in the United States because of how central the United States is to the world economy and how little what is going on outside of the United States impacts the average American compared to the average Russian or the average, you know, person in China or Brazil. Um, and I think that our education system doesn't really kick in terms of critical thinking until you get, outside of most
Graduate
high
school.
schools. Yeah. And really, yeah, graduate school. Though having been outside the United States and being, married to an immigrant and like knowing people from all kinds of different parts of the world, I think that, the United States education system shines in ways that other places don't. But in other ways, it's abysmal, and kind of generates the kind of people that are easy to manipulate and kind of take advantage of in a lot of ways, because I think that's kind of in service of the system. Um, I also think, kind of like the things we're talking about in terms of, people who are like rushing around trying to get people into various political projects or, reform efforts or, revolutionary sects or whatever. And I say revolutionary with air quotes. Um, that we're kind of, I feel like as a society, we're kind of in many ways in the same kind of place where people in the Soviet Union probably felt like they were in like the late 70s and 80s, where you're kind of like everything feels like a mess. The people who are kind of like really fundamentally in control or control society, from the top are, you know, uh, feel old and decrepit and, unresponsive in any meaningful way, and completely unaccountable. And so that to me, it makes sense that being in the United States feels like nothing can be done, because in many ways nothing can be done because things are so locked in place. Um, and that doesn't tend to, in my mind, that doesn't like bode well for like, the few, like for where we're heading. I don't know what that really means. I do feel like that, um, as much as I want everyone to follow like a single, like, or, a specific kind of orientation, a specific, set of strategies, I feel also like we really need to be kind of throwing everything at the wall. And people need to be trying all sorts of different things. And that without doing all these different sorts of things, we're not going to find the thing that works. Or the thing, it's like I'm, as much as I do my union work, I'm also do street medic. I'm also tenant organizing. I'm community self-defense, like mutual aid, like, um, all these things to me. And like I've even done some electoral work. Like, I feel like, um, people who are trying to get you like really herd you into one particular orientation or response to all this stuff, I think are doing so because it's in their interest for you to follow that one thing. And that we're not going to get out of the situation until we're through a lot of it. and we're not going to have a lot of control over what's happening. I feel like the more places where we can go and meet people and talk to people, and I do think learning to talk to people even when they're incoherent, and learn how to be able
Yes.
to make points to people in their incoherence that kind of like, flip on a light or a switch, is a really key skill that many people on the left seem to not be interested in or incapable of learning. I think a lot of this comes down to how education or our universities train people who decide that politics is a thing that they want to be interested in the United States. And these are the sorts of things we're going to be dealing with until I think we see a really serious break in how society functions, akin to like the way that like the Soviet system broke. And we've got to we need to learn, we need to build relationships, build where we can, do what we can as like society keeps tottering along, and it's going to hit a wall. And I'm not saying that this is like that's like a fundamental end or a disjuncture or some sort of like apocalyptic, like, and then like we had a civil war and then everything was better, but that we are getting, I feel like, to the end of like the logical conclusion of the kind of political logics that have been kind of like dictating how the United States has worked for the last like since like the Cold War. I don't know what that means. I don't know where that goes. I don't think it's going to be good. I think it'll be very terrible for a lot of people. But I do think that like we have to get through it, And I say that as someone who's like married to someone who lived through that kind of disjunction in their own society, and most people made it through, and society still functions, and they, but it was very difficult for everybody.
Although a lot of Slavic societies did lose like a fourth of their men. I'm just want to point that out, dudes. When shit hits the fan, you guys are not very anti-fragile.
Don't drink yourselves to death. Get your lives together. Don't be like clean living. Work out.
There's plenty for the left to be doing right now.
Sure.
There are, and you made a long list of the stuff that you do, and you can find even more stuff to do. I just think that people need to do it.
Well, the thing is, though, to get people to do it, you have to promise them realistic. I mean, and like, look, I know I'm usually accused of being the primogenitor ultra leftist. Like, no popular front. Don't tell anybody. Don't. Like workers' institutions, that's it. You can work. I'm not anti-electoral. You can vote for people locally, but if you are dumb enough to vote for anyone nationally, I don't have much for you.
Voting for people nationally doesn't even. It just don't think it matters beyond your personal thing. It's like that's a liberal decision, and it's your individual thing, and like don't turn it into a crusade.
I just don't. I mean, like, I don't really care about your conscience. I understand how numbers work, and what multipliers of scale mean. I hate to say it, libertarians are often right about that. Like a lot of people who really focus on national vote levels just simply don't understand math. And
most people don't understand math.
Well, that's true, but it's one of those things that I would tell people. I don't tell people not to be electoral, but like if you think you're gonna build a national program first, the problem that people got 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago was a focus on localism and piecemeal issues, which unfortunately we're seeing in Gen Z too. I don't have any like way to prove what I'm about to say, but I feel like small generations are given to this because they're just numerically not important enough to vote anything into power. And I know that makes people uncomfortable to say that when you were born really matters about how you can politically influence things. Not that, but how is kind of a big thing to look at. Like millennials and baby boomers fundamentally changed the infrastructure of the United States in ways that almost everything you think of as a U.S. invented tradition starts in the late 1940s and gets codified in the 50s.
They changed the geology of the planet.
Absolutely. I was reading, a text by Bortega about the changing of the Earth's crust and what it meant, particularly for baby boomers and density in cities, and how it seems ecological if you're only looking at stats, but if you don't look at anything downstream. And it really hit me how much of our social infrastructure is about to break because it was built for a generation that's literally dying and has taken most of the accumulated unvalorizable wealth with it. All right.
Here's the thing I would add to what Julie said. So Julie said there's so many things that you can do. My one caveat to that is that there are ways of doing things that are, I think, the correct way to do things. And there are ways to do things that are incredibly counterproductive and bad. And so I believe that, like, if you're going to be involved in anything that is, part of the left, there has to be like there needs to be a bottom-up aspect to it. You need to the workers being able to liberate themselves first requires workers to become agents of history, which means that we have to be able to learn how to critically think, how to debate, how to discuss things, make decisions collectively, not necessarily democratically, but collective decision making is like a key thing. We have to be able to build solidarity. We have to understand what mutual aid really means. And if we're not doing these things in our organizing work, and it includes liberal organizing work and reform organizing work, we're not doing it, right? There's no point in my mind. Yeah.
I don't normally get on generational politics a big bit, and I only do to actually push back on people who think that this doesn't matter. An economy where we have reformed housing in such a way that when and where you enter the market really affects your overall wealth. Like, not just that you're a homeowner, but when you became one really matters. And that's somewhat true in Europe, but even their fixed rate loans are actually variable. So when they raise the interest rates in Europe, it actually affects everyone within the course of 3 to 5 years, where that's not true here. So aren't those movers going to pass all their dollars to their millennial kids, though? And the answer is actually they've exhausted a lot of their wealth over a long course of time. Their millennial kids might inherit property, but unfortunately, death amongst boomers is kind of classed. Survival is a class good, people, for a whole lot of people. So the boomers that are still alive and squandering their wealth are the richer ones. And yes, you're going to see a small subset of millennials get that wealth. Now, I'm talking about wealth and not money, because we all know the government can print as much fucking money as it wants. Like, they could do something about the money if they wanted to. The liquidity could increase, right? That's not the point. The point is the wealth holdings that matter. Land matters. Material capital beyond nominal wealth matters. When we talk about valorizing wealth, what I mean is what your estimate of value is versus what you can sell it for. So if you can't sell that wealth for what it's valued at, that valuation is false. So we don't know. You literally cannot know what the true value of something is on the market until you sell it. Now, you can borrow against the hypothetical wealth, and as much money as people want to print and how the Fed wants to set interest rates will affect that. And I think interest rates probably should be something around almost zero, but it is nonetheless the case that just because wealth exists on paper doesn't mean you can sell it. All right. This is one of the things I talked about with the unions. Unions have a ton of paper wealth in buildings, not even in like assets and stocks. I mean, they have that too, but most of their value and wealth right now is in buildings. They didn't valorize it when interest rates were low to give themselves a war chest. And now if they were to do so, it would be financially kind of dumb. Although every union I work with is constantly trying to build new buildings more than they're even trying to recruit members to their union. Now, that's maybe an unfair generalization. I live in Utah, so you can take that with this is not the most union-friendly state in the world. But it's also, for a Western state, fairly unionized. And you know what they're doing? And 3 unions that I know about, trying to buy new union halls to accumulate more wealth for the union. All right. Now, that's going to be expensive right now. It was cheap 2 years ago or 3 years ago. But why are they doing that? Now, what does this have to do with the boomer economy? And I think we're right. We're in the end of the boomer economy. All right. I think it is telling that the boomers seem to know that in some real way, they are the end of their own history. They have not left much of a legacy in their dotage for anyone to build upon. Even their grandchildren tend to pick shit that was popular, really, that was made by silent generation people in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and maybe by Gen Xers in the 90s. But not, okay, if you go to I was spent a bit of time in Woodside. If you know the coastal California line, it's basically the place that's even more hoity-toity than Palo Alto. I have intellectual friends, and I was hanging out with these millionaires, and they were buying Thomas Kinkade paintings. Now, that seems like I'm just calling them tacky, all right? I'm not. What I am saying is their only vision for the future is a nostalgia for a past even they didn't live in, and we are 4 generations removed from. All right? The U.S. political dynamic for most of my lifetime has been dominated by people either masturbating to the society of the 1950s and early 60s or the economy of the 1950s and early 60s. I want my Fordism back. Why? I read any of these people who critique the PMC. Their model of a functional economy is the 1950s. No society on goddamn earth is going to be able to repeat the wealth hoarding mechanism of the end of World War II, because it wasn't just that the U.S. took a bunch of shit. It was also that everything else was destroyed. All right? That doesn't get through people that no one else is going to be easily able to do that again, because nuclear weapons and drones and 1,000 other things, the nukes aren't the only thing, make that too dangerous to repeat. The bourgeoisie wouldn't survive it either, and they know it. Now, as far as I can tell, we've structuralized capital to such a degree that the bourgeoisie is out to lunch. They don't need to be productive even by their own standards anymore. This is not something that socialists thought would happen. All right? There is nothing in Marx, nothing in Proudhon. No, I cannot find anything that thought that we would be able to build such a massive production base that we could function on fiat currency primarily, which is how we function. MMT is correct about how it works. All right? At least for the cores of the world. And yes, other states could do it if they form coalitions. We can talk about the political reasons why that's not likely, why that's unlikely to happen. There are many political reasons. It's not just U.S. hegemony preventing that, but it is possible. The question you have to ask yourself is, what about the skills required to do that? I was talking today about the engineer who was talking about doubling capacity. And I said, well, we all know, anyone who's looked at AI and looked at the power requisites of AI to do half of what they're promising it's going to be able to do, which it won't probably be able to do well, I may add, for reasons I can go into later. It's kind of an engineering problem. But even if you did, it's going to require a 50% increase in energy production to do. We don't know how to do that anymore. I'm going to say that again. We do not know how to do that anymore. The easy inputs that we built up in the early part of the 20th century are gone. Even nuclear, which is fairly effective, kind of clean, has major limits. All right. Now, let's not just stop there. Automation means that production growth will go to fewer people every time you open up a production site, even in other countries. You open up a factory in Africa, it's going to have a much more limited impact than, say, opening up a factory in China in the 1970s, and or opening up a factory in Russia in the 1930s, or opening up a factory in the United States in the 1810s, because we have gotten the efficiency so clean. Now, you're still exploiting people, all right? You have to exploit people for this to work. But you have to exploit fewer and fewer people. And I could get into like the way this works. It's about socially necessary labor time. And every time you automate something, you reduce socially necessary labor time. You reduce the amount of work. So you free up other kinds of stupid work to do. Now, bullshit jobs are bullshit because they're not necessary for production, but they're necessary for a bunch of other reasons. And they eat up tons of things. And talk about another thing that makes people uncomfortable. In some unions that are not particularly democratic, HR is more responsive to workers than the union is. Not because HR is your friend, HR is your fucking enemy. But HR's primary fear is what?
Lawsuits.
Getting sued. All right? It's an entire clue to deal with the legal system.
Jarek, I have a quick question for you about the rising, like basically the rising productivity because of efficiency. Doesn't that mean that the workers who are employed are more exploited in a Marxist sense?
Yeah, they are. I mean, I know that this is counterintuitive to people because if you look at areas where workers are paid well, you think, oh, workers are paid well, they're not as exploited. But if you look at the profit margins in those industries per worker, and you need to look at it per worker, which is very hard to do. There's no Bureau of Labor Statistics stat for this. You basically have to guess off of aggregate prices and like comparing it to what the GDP is and kind of fudge it. All right. This is why we can go all day long about whether or not there's a declining rate of profit or not, because we don't fucking agree how you measure profits. And there's the standard ways we do it would hide a bunch of shit. But you're right that basically those industries that are highly efficient reap a lot of profits per worker. Now, eventually, if it all moved to rentier relations, that would be a problem, right? So if everything became fixed, constant overhead, that would be a problem. You'd have to adjust currency flows for that. And you can totally do that. This is something Marxists weren't particularly good on, because Marx did kind of assume commodity money as the basic form of money, and commodity money is a form of money, but it's not the basic form of money. Currency is the basic form of money, and that's an IOU to the government. And that's really pretty much all it is. And it's an IOU for some kind of productive power somewhere. There are limits to that. I'm not saying there's not. Those limits tend to be the actual productive capacity of the society. And if that gets out of line, you will see inflation. Another thing that can cause inflation is trade imbalances and also the government paying more for certain goods within the system. So, and they can do that because they set prices for a lot of stuff indirectly. Now there are limits to that. Like if there's competition between states for goods, that does matter. I do kind of see that as a real problem. So I'm not one of these utopians who think you can just fix everything with currency, but when people say, oh, taxation is you're taking my money, it's an IOU to the government. Like, I don't know what you think it ever was. Like, there's no gold, there's no, the value of that IOU changes. That's why there's inflation and deflation. All right. So it's just something to think about. I'm trying to explain this simple. I could get into the nitty gritty of it. But production is what drives society. We could have all the currency in the fucking world, but if you're not able to buy the products of someone else's social labor, it doesn't fucking matter, does it? Right? Like, so this is the thing. We have to think and deal with this. And I find today that we find people who will deal with half of this and then pretend that we still operate off commodity money. Right? There are times when commodity money makes sense for states to do, but we haven't been in those times since World War One. That's when there's like few hegemons and. Like once there's empires, you have a tendency for currency to be pretty much set by the government in its value, but that floats. The float has a lot of effect. I'm kind of getting sidetracked here. It's something to think about when we talk about this efficiency problem, though. The question isn't the amount of dollars you're getting. It's what can you purchase for that? And if there is high exploitation, there's going to be more purchasing power per unit. And that's what you should really look at, not nominal income. All right. The reason why I think why this gets really bogged down today is I feel like we have a bourgeoisie that can survive off of the dividends off of shit that happened 60 years ago at this point. Like if you look at the richest families, not the richest individuals, the richest families, they're coasting off wealth divided within the family that was earned in the fucking 1950s. All right. The newer markets tend to be very rentier. They tend to be very immediate income driven and are doing things that leverage income versus debt. They don't have the same kind of accumulation. Sometimes when they go to valorize their project, their product like Facebook or Instagram or Twitter or all these kind of nebulous things, you see an instant collapse because the market valuation just isn't there. Like, and so don't get caught up just in the currency side of things. That's where a lot of the left thinks that there's one neat trick you can do to fix the fucking problem. There isn't. But back to the case of efficiency. So we tend to think, well, the poor in the developing world are more exploited. If you look at labor productivity, that doesn't seem to be the case. If you look at raw resources, that does. What do you think is more important? Okay, well then that's not an exploitation relationship. That's a direct extraction relationship. That's not exploitation. That's us literally just taking your shit. We might trick you into trading that shit for something that's not particularly valuable to you, or we might lock you in the contracts through labor arbitrage and other international legal mechanisms or treaties, or we just might threaten to bomb the shit out of you so you have to take our shit for your shit and you get, but that's not a relation of exploitation in the same way that the worker is. And I think a lot of people confuse those two because they think the problem is victimization. All right? I'm going to tell you from my standpoint as a labor person, as a Marxist, as a socialist, I care about victimization for moral reasons. It has very little effect on my politics. And that makes people uncomfortable, but it's because they have conflated this idea that we care about the worker because they're victimized. No, we care about the worker because they can reproduce society. And they
can overthrow, like they can disrupt and overthrow.
Right.
I'm gonna have to dip out here in a minute because
it's late tomorrow. Where you're at.
I did want to say to Sam's point, as someone who's had a family member get a reverse mortgage on my grandma's house, I feel like we're watching this huge blossoming of various mechanisms for recapturing all the wealth that I think working baby boomers accumulated over the years and their parents. And so I feel like we're in an era where we're not going to see a repeat of the 80s and 90s. There's no slack in the system for it. We have to be prepared for what that's going to look like. It's going to be weird. It's going to be scary, I think, in a lot of ways. I think there's this idea that somehow what we're going to keep, cycling through history. It's just going to over and over again. We're going to keep seeing these things. And I think that the way capitalism structures, like, the economy and how the economy affects politics, it's going to be I think that we are getting to a point where I don't understand what the next step is to make this all work. And everyone who offers up explanations, they seem to like not be very satisfactory to me. And it seems like I don't see who in the 70s, there had been people formulating neoliberalism for, 1 to 2 decades beforehand. And I don't see who is the equivalent today coming up with the next structure that's going to keep things moving along in a way that allows capital to be productive. And so I just tell everyone, you've got to get your shit together. Everyone needs to get their skills. They need to learn how to do things. They need to learn how to be useful to their neighbors and their coworkers. They need to learn how to be able to communicate with people without being condescending and combative in a way that turns people off. And that is, or at least pedagogical in a way that's effective. And I feel like so many people don't really have those skills. We should be building everything from presses to the capacity to, treat gunshot wounds to, the ability to, formulate an autonomous politics as workers in this moment. And on that happy note, I'm going to let you all go to bed because I got to go to bed.
Good night.
And don't shut things down just because I'm off the call. I'll talk to you all later. See you in the Discord.
All right. Take care. All right. So to pick up on one of the things I've started talking about was decadence. A lot of Marxists don't like decadence theory, even though it's implied in the Brumaire. Actually, it's kind of already there. You can call it regression theory. You can call it what you want. It's not just about profit rates. This is a problem. A lot of people think profit rates explain pretty much everything that's going on. There are social tendencies that are larger than capitalism, and I know that capitalism is the totality of production, and I know we like to focus on that, but there are other things. For example, highly specialized elites are not unique to capitalism. Maybe the scale and intensity of the specializations is unique to capitalism, but that tendency has existed in other complex societies before. That is energy intensive over time. And I'll give you an example of that. Literally, we are outsourcing things to robots that basically repeat what humans do in aggregate, that critical think only by individual training patterns that they can throw up in each instance. All right. They don't think like people. They mimic what people do and aggregate them. The amount of power we are using for that is astronomical. If you think we wasted power on shit like NFTs, you haven't seen anything like the projections on what LLMs require. But because it doesn't happen for you, you think you're not trading anything off by doing that. And that is endemic in our system, including in our education system, because it creates multiple dependencies. Okay, I'll give you an example of that. I keep on being told I don't need to teach people to code. The AI can do it. Well, who builds the AI? Monopoly capital holders in Silicon Valley, which makes you dependent on those things working. But they have no reason to tell you what the actual energy cost to what they're doing is. And by the way, LLMs right now have no clear road to profitability. Goldman Sachs has been clear about that. The technological pessimists are right. It can do a lot of shit. But the power cost versus what a person can do actually doesn't make sense. It can make a person work more efficiently, but it can't fully replace them. And the efficiency is actually offset by increased power inputs. We've already talked about the fact low-hanging sources of power don't exist. That's not just a capitalism problem. We can innovate around it. I'm not one of these people who thinks everything has to be degrowth and we have to base everything off of 19th century soil models. But I will tell you, there are real limits to things that you don't think have a physical infrastructure because it's not at your consumption point. All right? This is a problem right now. This is a big problem right now. All right? I'll give you another example of that. Literacy has been declining in the developed world for the first time for about now. We started seeing it in 8th graders in 2015. We started seeing it in 4th graders in 2021. It's exacerbated by COVID, but it all the trends predate COVID. Quit blaming COVID for everything. It doesn't explain everything that happened. It's not just about bad education. Right, bad education's endemic. I get it. There's a lot of shitty education out there, but why is it shitty? Right? What are the inputs in, inputs out? Right? Well, one of the things that we have used education for is to hold particularly young men, but a lot of people, in some kind of limbo and keep them out of the job market on the low end of the wage scale. Now, why do we do that? Okay, now we might not do it for very much longer because there's a lot less people on the low end of the wage scale. That's why I want to talk to something Julie brought up. My father has a hard time with lowering the minimum wage. He's not an anti-worker. He's a blue-collar guy. Why does he have a hard time with it? Because the lower middle-class wage has been stagnant during this time period. It's been the low end of the wage thing that's moved up. There's also growth in certain highly specialized areas. But if you're what we might call a relatively skilled laborer with no cartelling, the stats have not been good for you. Your purchasing power has gone down. Now, that's still bad. You should still be supporting a minimum wage because it theoretically could raise the basis for everybody. But if you don't think that's politically possible, there actually is an incentive not to raise the wage. Now, it's a bullshit false consciousness kind of thing in the sense that it's a bad incentive in the long run, but it's perfectly logical in the immediate one. And it is nightmarish to deal with because you have to tell people that you can deliver something that no one's proven to them they can. Since I have been born, the minimum wage has been raised twice. Maybe 3 times. I think actually it's 3 times. But, all right. And there's like 15 years between 2 of them. Right? The first one in like 2009, 10. And then the one before that in like the beginning of the 90s. And I think there was one in the 80s. So I might be wrong. It might be 3 times. 3 times. All right? 3 times. Now, we can throw the stats at you. We've been talking about the fight for 15 or the fight for 25 or whatever for a long time. If you look at the like $1.50 purchasing power when we passed the like first major minimum wage law, the equivalent today is like $29 an hour. All right? There's no way that you are going to get. And this is true in Europe, by the way. I mean, Europe has way better minimum wage laws, but they're still basically, well, they're not even minimum wage laws, actually. A lot of Scandinavian countries, for example, don't technically have minimum wage laws. They have sectoral bargaining that functionally act as minimum wage laws. There's just no need for them on the books because they bargain with the unions. But there is a way in which that is like a stopgap at social reproduction. It does do what Marsh predicts. All right. It stops you at about, say, $22 to $25 an hour, which adjusted for cost. Now, it's worse here. It is worse here. We will immiserate a certain number of people below social reproduction off the hope that that job is temporary. All right. And that's what you hear is these jobs are temporary. You're not supposed to work fast food forever. You're not supposed to be a pizza guy for all your life, right?
But everybody wants to eat pizza. Right.
So there's a structure that we built in that literally can't support itself. And the market has risen it to, again, below social reproduction. You cannot raise a family and reproduce workers off of $15 an hour. You can't. I can't think of a single polity in the United States where that would really work of any significant size. And the places where they would work, the average wage is a little lower than that. All right. And the other thing is, like, unlike a lot of European countries, the purchasing power differences between parts of the United States is massive. So, whereas, like, you see that in the EU, but it's between countries and maybe one metropole. It's not like the difference between, like, Cleveland versus New York versus, and that's actually equaling out right now. One of the reasons why is the concentration of certain kinds of jobs aren't needed as much. The technology really has fixed some of that. We're not needed in these megapolises in the same way, but that's going to spread out the cost. All right. Now, people will, I remember reading something where Angela Nagel was, like, almost talking about it as a PMC conspiracy theory. And I was just like, no, that's how economies work. Like, if you can flatten out the cost, you're going to do it. And yet we still have relatively high density areas because you still want to be relatively close to them because there's a limit to that leverage, right? Because the social services start to break down. If you've ever lived in, say, Jackson, Mississippi, or Jefferson Parish in Louisiana, or the bad end of St. Louis, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You'd rather be poor in most of, say, New York than you would in St. Louis and even California. All right. One of the differences between the industrial Northeast liberal areas and the West Coast is the West Coast doesn't have a Fordist infrastructure from the 50s. It didn't ever develop it. They skipped that period. It doesn't exist. They had little bits of it, like, yeah, there were streetcars in San Francisco, right? But it didn't have this large apparatus that exists in New York, which is one of the reasons why the homeless problem is worse. And that's accepted in the Northeast for obvious reasons. No one really wants to look at a bunch of homeless people sickles. You don't want to deal with thousands dead in a winter. Not even capitalists want to deal with that. It's too disheartening. It's too demoralizing. You might get it, right? One of the things that's happened under the Biden administration that I haven't heard a lot of people talk about is strategic straining of resources in the Northeast, which does two things. It turns minority communities against immigrants falsely because they are made to believe that the immigrants are taking their entitlement goods, which they're not, but that's neither here nor there. And it gives reason to pass laws to undo the Fordist infrastructure of those areas. You have laws in New York and parts of the Northeast that prevent homelessness. They will find a place for you. They don't have that in California, and they throw tons of money at it in California, and it doesn't fix shit, right? They throw billions of dollars at that shit all the time, but it goes through so many third-party neoliberal apparatuses that money just all gets soaked up before they build anything. It goes to like 50 different nested NGOs. All right, it just soaks it up. And those NGOs have no incentive to fix the problem because if they did, they'd be out of a goddamn job. All right? That was kind of the evil genius of neoliberalism, but we don't have the capacity for that anymore. We really don't have the capacity for all that additional unnecessary middleman shit anymore. So it just goes to nothing.
Yeah, like you mentioned Jackson, Mississippi, and I was working on a local public transportation project and found out that, like, Jackson, Mississippi has a much better public transit system than where I live in Warren, Ohio does. Like, we have nothing here. We have nothing. Nothing.
When I lived in Macon, Georgia, which used to be a mill town, and I know people thought when I said I was from a mill town, they thought I was from the Northeast. And I'm like, no, there was mill towns in the South. They were paper mills. There was and textile mills. They were, wherever the paper and textile mills, that's going to be the shittiest parts of capitalism. That's how they move. Like, where are they now? They're in Bangladesh. All right. Used to be in the South. Where the black people were. And
we're getting a paper mill here.
Yeah. Oh, great. Yeah. By the way, that's the kind of reshoring you're going to get too. Because those are still fairly labor-intensive industries. There's not a way to get them a whole lot more efficient that we found, other than maybe AI. But see problems with power grid that I just mentioned. All right, we already have rolling blackouts now. You're asking, I mean, like Google and Microsoft project that their energy usage is gonna like triple to gigawatt, like 2 to 3. It's the enormity of scale is unbelievable, because no LLM has efficiency in its code. It can't work efficiently. All right? You can't scour everything that's ever been written efficiently. I don't know why people don't understand this. That energy is coming out somewhere. But there's a lot of places where it doesn't have infrastructure. Like if you're poor in LA, as long as you don't end up homeless on Skid Row, which is a very bad place to be and has a very high crime rate. But you hear these people always complaining about all the homeless people and all the danger in LA and San Francisco. And there's some. It's statistically about the same that it's been since the 90s. All right. The worst cities but there are areas. So the worst cities for crime in the United States are like Jackson, Mississippi, New Orleans, Jefferson Parish, and Stockton, California. So it's not all red states. Dayton, Ohio, St. Louis was really, really bad for a long time. Sometimes Detroit. Macon, Georgia was really, really bad. Where I'm from, it had like the third worst crime rate in the country at one point per capita, not in absolute numbers. But if you look at like specific neighborhoods, they are in the big metropolitan areas. It's just like we've just given like 1% of LA and like less of New York, but a little bit of the Tenderloin in San Francisco as like a sacrifice zone. All right. Like, you don't want to be there. And I don't want to like shit on well-meaning left liberals for this, but I remember them just saying, we need to protect the encampments. And in a way, I agree with them because, like, look, I work in shelters. You don't want to be in shelters. Like, they're disgusting. Not all of them, but some of them are really, really gross. I get why people would rather be in a tent. However, normalizing tent cities is not really something you actually want to do. All right. And if the best thing you can think of to do to help the homeless population is to just protect them in their immiseration from the cops, you're fucked. And that was a strategy actively pursued by a lot of other middle class leftists from 2016 to about COVID. Then after that, when the housing crisis got way worse, we don't do shit. All right. I don't see those encampments to protect homeless people anymore. All right. Well, one of the things is who's homeless now. Now, here in SLC, it's not yet there are some people here who are workers and homeless, and I actually teach some of their kids, by the way. I mean, I'm a public school teacher. I interact with all levels of society. But if you go to California right now, there are more people homeless who have stable work than people who don't. All right? We talk about this in terms of the housing crisis. But we don't really talk about it in a way that actually addresses it directly. One of the things you'd have to do is destroy a lot of wealth, not just in YIMBYism and New York style development and the people who infiltrate the DSA to do land development, which, by the way, I only learned recently was a thing. DSA, if you're going to purge anybody, it wouldn't be Trotskyist or even MLs. It'd be those fuckers. But nonetheless, you see this, but it's framed in terms of like returning to a middle class way of life. That is not really viable. And I have a lot of leftists who have bad habits. When we open up high density housing on the west side, It is leftists protesting the high density housing as much as rightists, not for NIMBYism, but for gentrification. But they're also protecting their housing values, whether they're honest about it or not. Right? Like, this is a milieu where the reforms almost always have unforeseen consequences and actually foreseen consequences that we don't want to talk about. This is why I don't put a lot of hope in electoral reformism, because these incentives are built up. If you wanted to fight that, if you wanted to pursue electoral strategy, you would need think tanks, systematic things. I honestly think you'd even need a militia, frankly, to be able to deal with the problems you're going to have to get to fix it before you even get to the electoral stage. But people don't want to hear that because there's not one neat trick to fix. But if people promise you everything and ask you to sacrifice nothing, they're going to give you nothing, because if they actually demand a lot from you and they don't pay up, what are you going to do to them? Where if they're just giving you hopes and dreams, well, are you going to tear them apart? Probably not. You might, but the cost of that is not worth the loss. Whereas if they took everything from you, I don't know, maybe you would. All right? That's an incentive structure. That's not just a capitalist incentive structure. You see that shit in hunter-gatherer societies. All right? So sometimes, yes, it's capitalism. Yes, capitalism is the overarching dynamic of the human being, and it changes our human nature in some fundamental ways. But there are other things involved in this that are not just that. And if you can't catch it, you're fucked. All right? People who promise you hopes and dreams do actually cost you something. It's just not obvious. It is lost opportunity. It is lost rewards because of no risk. And I know people will say, oh, you talk about risk and rewards. That's neoliberalism. Motherfucker, you don't get something from nothing. The only thing that you can create out of nothing is money. And even that, you probably need to have guns or a large factory, one or the other. Or, in the United States case, it's nice to have both. By the way, a lot of the way we talk about this in the United States is fundamentally wrong. I keep on hearing people say we don't make anything in the U.S. We're the second largest industrial economy in the world. We bypassed Europe. We don't employ anyone in it. We make plenty of shit. It just doesn't involve you. You aren't part of that circuit. We're not making it for you either. All right. Once you realize that, yes, we have a trade deficit. Absolutely. But we're still the second largest, which tells you how much useless consumption we're doing. If we're the second largest industrial producer in the world and we still have a massive trade deficit. And what does that consumption go into? It isn't going to you. I mean, yeah, we have all these stupid widgets that die every 4 years. By the way, that's a form of inflation. All right. When shit breaks all the time so that the lower price point is there, that's not inflation in terms of money. It's inflation in terms of product that you get for that money. And that's everywhere. When's the last time you bought a piece of furniture that was designed to last more than 4 years? Right? Half the shit you have is made out of MDF that if you get wet will fall apart. All right? I'm not saying that, like, oh, things were better in the olden days when we handcrafted everything. Like, there is an efficiency to labor. Taylorism does provide benefits. I don't want to pretend like it doesn't. But, like, you don't even know how much value has been lost because you're not comparing like to like even in the same product. And there's no statistic really keeping up with this. All right? Like, I have shit from the 60s that still works. I have very little from the 90s that still works. And I have almost nothing from 15 years ago that still works. Because even if it's well made, see this shit again. This is well made, by the way. They're going to brick it itself. All right. What does that tell you about purchasing power? What does that tell you about what we're actually able to produce? It tells you we're exhausting shit, just not in nominal value. The nominal value is kind of meaningless. I mean, it can boost production. You can create a lot with credit, right? You can. But nonetheless, if everything's getting shittier and shittier made, what are you going to do? I mean, I wanted you to look at the American car industry. The Chinese can produce an EV that is kind of nicer than anything. Now, there's tons of subsidies in it. There's all kinds of market distortions and quotation marks in it. That's all true. Although those subsidies are being phased out, by the way. But they can produce an EV that is nicer than a Tesla for like, I don't know, like half, maybe even a third of the price, depending on what kind of model that you want to get. Right? Where do you think all this protectionism is coming from all of a sudden? And you're not going to get the left to oppose it because we want to reshore things. But with what people? Are you missing that we're having a demographic crisis? Now, ultimately, I actually think this demographic crisis is a good thing. Like, I'm not pro-death. I'm not one of these voluntary human extinction people. But I do think that there is a reason why populations are ebbing out in a certain way. All right. However, and it's good that it's doing it on its own. We don't have to like passing draconian policies about this tend to backfire. See China and women for that. But I do think we have to be completely realistic in the fact that even with all this efficiency, if this AI doesn't produce what you think it's going to produce, and by the way, the timing of this rollout, I'm not being conspiratorial here, but there are reasons why it got rolled out when it got rolled out. Some of this technology has been worked on for 20 years. There was already basic forms of it in your fucking spell checker. All right? So why did it get rolled out when it got rolled out? Where all of a sudden a bunch of skilled tech workers could command a whole lot of value. Because they are pretty highly exploited. You make a lot of money off of them. But they can command a lot because there's not that many people who can do it. We got to push back on that. But the thing is, what they released is it pushes number go up at the expense of real material inputs that we don't have. And it isn't clear that it's leading to more productive efficiency. And I keep on focusing on this because if you don't see this big, new, bright, shiny, super, everything's going to change. We live in the innovation age. If I hear someone say that to me one more time, I'm going to take the fucking tongue. Because they're lying. The innovation age was the 19th century to the early 20th. What you are dealing with now is the exponential, not really, seemingly exponential return curves off of innovation, some of which is over a century old. You do not see, like, I almost promise you, despite all that this stupid thing has changed, and I'm holding, for those of you who are listening later, I'm holding up a cell phone. The changes in transportation and everything else have barely kept up with it. And a lot of the attempts to take this technology and make it into a car or a bomb have not gone so well. All right. Ask the Houthis how afraid they are of our drones when you can't actually get people to go do basic Clausewitzian warfare. And the reason why we can't is because there's so many. We've even turned the military over to this. And the Republicans and the conservatives are picking up on this. And they're not wrong to pick up. Their answers are stupid. All right. Their answers are like, have your cake and eat it to Fantasyland world. You know, their answers are subsidies for me, neoliberalism for thee, except that we don't even know how neoliberalism works, so we can't even really do that. All right. We haven't been able to do that since 2007. I don't think you've noticed that we've just been fiddling around with all that shit for a while. We can't do it well anymore. So you're going to hear people, if people have to tell you you are in an innovation age, it's like when someone tells you they're the king. If they have to say it that much, it's because it's no longer true. Because they're trying to sell you that. And if like, I'm going to tell you, like the smartphone, the innovation of the smartphone was obvious to me. The innovation of a lot of the shit I'm seeing is going to change everything now is not. This is a dying culture. We've been through this before. It was dying on the eve of the world wars, by the way. A lot of technical stuff was slowing down, and we picked it up with war. But we don't even really want to do that right. We're not even like that committed to killing people properly. As horrifying as that is. And that's with small nations who are imposing losses, the scale of which we haven't seen in terms of per capita since World War II. What is happening in the Levant right now is basically what the Nazis did to Belarus. It's the same percentage of the population potentially going to be lost of one side. Now, that might be a political disaster, but it's a military objective. I point all this out because despite that, you still can't see anyone, like, you know, look at the Russians. I'm gonna give the Russians some credit on something. They tried to fight war the smart way, the US way, for a year. And it did not go that well for them. Then they switched back to Clausewitzian tactics. Just good old fucking industrial artillery.
I want to go back to something that you mentioned a couple minutes ago, because you said it like everybody knows the answer, but it was you said ask the Houthis what they think about that. And so what you're saying is the drones haven't been effective against Yemen, or did I get that the opposite?
No, you know, they haven't been that effective against them. And one of the reasons why is that we're not doing large scale drone artillery, and we could make drones effective, but you'd have to really risk U.S. life and U.S. naval power, and we're not really that willing to do it. All right, like, but like the thing is, no one in the West is willing to do even partial social mobilization. Not even, like, when you think about what happened in World War II, that's nearly total social mobilization. It's not completely total. There's never been true total social mobilization. But what you have something right now is something like what you saw in the early modern period, where the armies are actually relatively small. All right. And you can do a whole lot if all you need to do is kill people. But if you actually have strategic objectives that need to be strategically achieved, and people can hide out in caves, it's a lot harder to do shit. It's not just the Houthis, go after the Taliban. Like, it's kind of proof of concept. Like, the United States can level most of these countries if they wanted to, but they'd have to risk their own people, and they'd have to risk global nuclear war. And so, like, you know, let's just let them bomb around the margins. It's a disturbing thing to think about, to talk about it that way. But that's because we even use war as a way to build rentier profits. War, by and large, if you actually sustain losses, is not profitable. The U.S. believed that war was profitable primarily because they were the people who didn't get bombed in World War II. And they were able to use their excess production to rebuild Europe. Now, eventually that became a problem at the end of the 1960s. But it was gangbusters when it wasn't. Because you didn't just have to sell, you didn't just sell to your market, you could sell to other markets for cheap. You weren't losing much. You could still make it off on scale. Right? If you're a leftist and you don't understand at least 100 years of economic history, shut the fuck up for people who do. All right? I'm not saying you can't be a leftist. I'm not saying you're a bad person. I'm not saying, like, we can't all do everything. Like, there's other things people need to do. I'm not good at dressing wounds. Like, if you get shot around me, I can kind of stop your bleeding, but you better get someone like, you know, Nurse John around you, or you're pretty much not going to last very long. All right. So we need all types, but that means like I don't correct people who know how to dress a wound, right? I don't correct people who can get a bullet out of my gut.
I don't give advice to someone when I take my car in to get fixed.
Right. And the complexity of cars is one of these things. Like, there's a military base. I was reading about this the other day that was trying to rebuild the Willys, which we used, all of Europe, all of the West used to be able to drop a car from a fucking crate off of an aircraft carrier, and you could build it on spec within 45 minutes. Right? No electronic parts at all. We can't totally replicate that right now. All right. Another example of that, and this is what decadence and technology loss means. People think all this is always exponential, that we always have everything from the past. We don't really know how we built elements of the first rockets that went into outer space. This is part of why there's all these conspiracies about it. One, because we put them on tape drives that are non-accessible anymore, and two, because we rely on computers so much, we don't have people who still remember the rest of its skills and can retro-engineer it. All right. Now we can build other things that do the same thing, maybe even better. But we've lost that basic skill. So if other components became inaccessible to us, I don't know, like lithium, it would be hard to go back to prior technologies. We don't remember how to easily build them. It really is kind of reinventing the wheel. I mean, the wheel's obvious, but nonetheless, we'd probably figure it out if we had to, but we don't really have to right now. This is one of the, John was talking about how hegemony kind of makes you a little bit dumb. I don't think people are dumb, but I do think hegemons are kind of dumb. And the reason why is that you can outsource pretty much everything on dependencies. You don't really need to know how to do that anymore. There's a reason why, like, the people who speak the lingua franca don't usually speak more than one language. They don't need to. All right. There's no incentive. Whereas I go to, I don't know, I was in Korea, right? And I would meet people from, let's say, I'm going to pick a place, Cambodia. And they can speak like 8 languages, a few of which are not even related to any language that they speak. Trying to get American to get their tongue around like Farsi or Arabic. And I say this as a person who, even though I can kind of speak Hebrew, like hit Arabic and I was like, fuck it. And I speak multiple languages. I was just like, I'm done. Right? I just gave up. It's too hard. Because I didn't really need to. And the reason why I didn't really need to is almost everyone I interacted with would get frustrated with me, even shopkeepers, and switch back to English or some other one. Sometimes it was Spanish or some other language that I could speak. Like, and yeah, it's super frustrating, right? Because other people also like, oh God, it's a hegemon. We have to deal with their bullshit again. They can't speak any languages. Oh God. Well, they're going to try to speak ours and they're going to butcher it. And I'm going to get tired of that shit, but I already know how to speak English. So I'm going to transfer over. Right. But okay, that's obvious. That's language. That's something we all deal with. Right. But think about that in terms of other skills. All right. One of the things about US manufacturing that is true is we don't build anything from stern to end here. We parse it out, put it together. The global supply chain is massive. It's gotten smaller since COVID, but like, we don't have a complete stern to tail production process on pretty much anything but raw goods, like finishing steel. We do that pretty much. But like finished product, we finish stuff and we build raw materials for stuff and we build good versions of raw materials for stuff. But like a whole lot of intermediate steps, we don't do. But we're still super productive because the entire thing's done that way, right? It's easier to do. It's going to get more complicated in the future, and attempts to reshore things without like reskilling, retrading, dealing with the 50 different laws. The amount of klug in the United States is actually abnormal historically. All right. Like very few societies have tried to live off of 50 different sets of laws in the same goddamn country with 4 or 5 different levels of government that work differently in each of those 50 separate sets of laws that somehow have a national government, which, by the way, the national government doesn't regulate how it's decided upon. That's decided by those 50 different places with the 50 different states of law. Even the national government election isn't its own priority. It's either outsourced to private corporations like the parties, or it's made by state law. There's a few things that have been fixed by the federal judiciary, like civil rights law, but even that's like only off some weird interpretations of, well, not weird. Like it requires the Civil War amendments to be possible. It's something to think about. When I talk to Europeans, I don't always think they understand this about the United States. Like I'm like, no, like the United States is not like France. It's like the EU, but like with a more powerful central government, but also a less powerful central government at the same time. Think of the central government as like an insurance company that kills people. Like that's pretty much what it is, and like it's a bank. And then all the actual social services, most of them are done by the states who don't have currency sovereignty. That works out great for them. Which is why the fact we actually do have to tax for shit like education, because the people who issue and pay for most education are not the issuers of currency. Fun stuff, right? Have you ever thought that maybe that's kind of on purpose? That like all the social services are run by the people that actually do have to tax shit, so there's an incentive not to empower people to do it. You ever thought, like, not on like the money flow, on the power flows? Like, if you try to run socialized medicine in California, you're actually going to have to play market prices like a firm, not like a government, because you don't have the power to print your own money, which is, by the way, that same thing that the EU's in. And that's working out real well for them too. Particularly when Germany gets all weird like it is right now. So, you know, I think this is something we have to think about when we talk about why there are so many problems in the United States. I mean, pretty much everybody's accepted the Constitution doesn't work, but we all worship it, even though we all know it doesn't work. Like, no one really thinks it works. Like, we all just like worship it because we have the longest standing constitution that of any nation in the, which, by the way, when people are like, America is a very young country, you're full of shit. America is actually a very old country as far as countries with legal documents go. Sure, there's France and there's England, you know, which are very old national polities, but like Italy and Germany were unified countries and unified cultures that had a unified national language in the last, I don't know, 150 years. We are not a young country. We like to tell ourselves that because we're like, oh, we're like the teenage fuck-ups on the world stage. We're as geriatric as our fucking leadership. Yeah, and Europe is, you know, Europe has at least young people. We do from immigration. One of the things I want to talk about, like right now, I mean, for example, I was hearing Republicans get mad about how all the new jobs are going to immigrants. I'm like, aside from the 10% of men who've given up on work because there's no way they can purchase anything, and the people from other countries can purchase stuff by playing off the difference in value of our currency here versus there, and Forex trade, that's why they can do it, right? Just like, you know, how Britain could pretend it had an economy for so long by leveraging the value of labor in the Slavic areas of the EU, which, by the way, now that they've gotten rid of that ability to leverage it and it's been clear what they can actually produce, they're becoming, on average, poorer than the average Polish person. That's been great. And no, I'm not making that up. I'm not even exaggerating it very much. There's a bunch of very rich people there and a lot of very poor people there. Effectively, London's going to be like Guatemala City in a couple of years. Right? There's a lot of rich people in Guatemala City too, and then there's like sinkholes and destitute poverty and no power. I mean, like, so, you know, if you want that, go fucking for it. But they were able to avoid that after they lost their empire by leveraging this stuff off of the EU trade, and they shot themselves in the foot on that because that really wasn't good for the average British citizen either. Like, it wasn't just irrational. All right. But the downstream effects are massive. The United States is going to go through something similar, except we have a lot more physical resources and a lot more ultra rich, and I have no idea where that's all going to go, but it doesn't look like it's going to go anywhere good. I mean, we really should start talking about oligarchs here. You know, I mean, yeah, they're real in the places we talk about them too, but like, I don't know why you don't call Elon Musk a fucking oligarch messing with politics, or Peter Thiel an oligarch messing with, or fucking Bill Gates. I mean, it's not just the Republicans. Oligarch messing with politics, or the Mercer family. It's ridiculous. What's your thoughts on Brazilianization thesis from Alex Hochili? I don't know. I think that's kind of true. Critical support for Brexit for accidentally leading to a united Ireland. Anyway, let's see here. Okay. We've been going for 2 hours and 10 minutes. We've had a pretty live call thing. I haven't really answered everything here. The NTA.
Well, you had a lot to say.
Yeah, I've been mad. I like. I've been watching all this bullshit about like how we should care about this election, and I'm just like, set it all on fucking fire. I'm tired of pretending anymore. And if I hear one more goddamn thing about Bernie or Corbyn or Syriza or Podemos or any of that shit, one more time about how we'd be better off if they won, you didn't live in that world. Ask yourself why, instead of pretending that you can have your fucking Big Walk Candy Mountain back. I'm tired of listening to it.
Well,
Like-
I mean, people want to imagine a better timeline. It's just an escape. It's just a fantasy escape.
I would rather people escape not pretending that they did politics. Go watch Game of Thrones. All your media is escapist anyway. When's the last time? Like, where are the movies about the Afghan war? Where are the movies about, like, even organized crime in the last 20 years? I mean, they kind of exist sometimes. Like, I know we always complain about like the moral effects of comic book movies, but that actually has the order of operations backwards. Like, why do we get comic book movies? Because you can get an insurance company to insure them. You don't have to take that many risks, and you can produce them on a factory line, and they're popular everywhere because you don't need any cultural nuance to them at all. And we're all sick of it now, but we replaced it with what exactly? The edginess of medieval fantasy? Like, look, I like Dragon Show as much as the next guy. Like, you know, I like sugar, right? Like, I don't mind sugar, but I'm a diabetic, so I don't have to eat sugar all the time or I'll fucking die. So, like, a lot of people have the all sugar media diet. And by the way, that's not just true for stupid entertainment. It's also true for the news you watch. The independent media mostly exists to flatter you. Why does it flatter you? Because it needs your patronage. I have a day job. It would hurt me if I didn't make any money, but I'd live. I don't have that many incentives to lie to you. Like, I can even tell you the percentage of income that you are, and thank you for offsetting inflation costs and enabling me to help some people, but like, that's all you're really doing. But there are bad incentives in that media. It is like the candy of news. And we saw this with the major networks. Yeah, we saw it with MSNBC and Fox and CNN. Pick your poison for the major mainstream old people parties to give major mainstream old people things to sell their whatever pills they need to be sold so that they fade into this good night in relative uncomfort. But, and you know it's for old people because watch the ads. It's like 90% prescriptions. However, independent media is not financially independent. They either get it from patronizing an audience capture, or they get it from patrons who you don't know about. That's really the only two ways to be profitable. And that's kind of saying something because the upfront costs of this are not that high. All right. We've effectively removed most of the labor from this. You can figure out why the profitability is what it is. It's still exhausting. It's like how we all think that every OnlyFans girl is making a ton of money when they're probably making about $500 a month, which, that's depressing. That's really something. But
that's enough to get groceries.
It is. And if you got to eat, you got to eat. Not judging sex workers, but I am just pointing out that that's a bizarre set of incentives. But you know, you got to do what you got to do, right? Parasocialize everything. I have some libertarians like, yeah, we're all just gonna have relationships with creators, and you don't need that many people. And I'm like, it's true, right? I have an audience of approximately 600 subscribers, which puts me in the upper 25% of Patreon, by the way. I have a podcast listenership that's in the top 90% of podcasts. That doesn't mean shit because there's so many podcasts that don't do shit no one listens to. I'm not a household name. The top 1% may be billionaires, but this stuff operates on power law. But nonetheless, you could eke out a living if you're willing to flatter people and maintain them. It's a bad incentive for telling people the truth. Because it hurts. If you were honest about what you feel, even if you're not right, or admitting that you're wrong, the worst thing you can do as a pundit is admit that you're wrong. All right? Pundits are constantly fucking wrong. They have a worse prediction record than chance. If you apologize for it, you're fucked. That's why I'm not a pundit, because I'm wrong all the time and I try to tell you. All right? That's the only reason I'm not a pundit. If we're frank, I do everything they do, except I actually read what I talk about for the most part. My memory's fading. I'm getting fucking old. But so you got some of these pundits doing this well into their 70s. They're all reading off a teleprompter with a whole team behind them. You don't think a 70-year-old's actually doing all that by themselves, do you? But these incentives are bad. And it is kind of like the sugar of news. You can get good stuff from it, but you can't trust anybody. All right? And don't just pick the one you like, because that's like, if you flatter yourself, that's usually the road to ruin. You might know one thing really well. There are people in my audience who know a lot of shit about one thing way better than me. And some of them are in the chat right now. They really do. All right. My job as a teacher is to synthesize all that stuff and present it to people and find the people that actually know shit and listen to them and then figure out what they don't know about, figure out the flaws. And that takes a lot of creative and critical thinking. And if I just flattered my audience all the time, I wouldn't do that. I would be figuring out how to get you to subscribe to Patreon more. The only concession I've made to getting people to subscribe to Patreon more was getting back on Twitter. And I feel gross about that. And that's because Twitter, for all of its bad incentives, is like a way to get people to listen to you. It's gross. It's disgusting. I hate it. All the incentives are terrible. But at least it's organic. Its growth is slightly organic. I mean, it's not totally because of the blue check shit and all that stuff. But like, it's not like Facebook, which throttles down everything you don't pay for. It's, Facebook's making money by sucking off of everything else. That's how it makes money. It's the ultimate middleman. Same thing with Google, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, point to all this is, there's nothing wrong with liking Dragon Show. There's nothing wrong with watching your favorite streamers. But dear God, don't believe everything they say. Don't believe everything I say. I am often full of shit. I don't mean to be. All right. But I have been wrong about some big stuff. Usually because, believe it or not, as cynical as I am, I have discovered lately I'm not cynical enough. I'm just not. There seems to be a limit to how I think human depravity works, and you guys keep finding it. Not you, my audience, but you, the world. I'm just like, wow, this is worse than I even thought. I thought I was cynical, but I am not cynical enough. And that's kind of disheartening. And the thing is, when I say cynical, I'm actually not cynical about individuals. I think individuals respond to their incentive structures. If people are dumb, to use Julie's word, it's because we built a dumb society. And it's not we all are equally complicit in that. I'm going to be very clear. It's elites and leaderships. Which is why I don't like trust the people who like, oh, we just need some big figure to come save us and some authority and some leader. Because that tends to make people really dependent on the leader. And what happens when the leader inevitably dies? There's a reason why those kinds of dictatorships without strong institutions behind them tend to collapse after the death of one okay leader. Maybe two, but 3 generations out, what you got? All right. And this is why Mike Davis was super cynical about the future when he died. He was worried about the declining in collective leadership. And we see this in democracies and non-democracies, etc. Because we got these clue points that are tying all that collective leadership up and making it fragile. They're real. They're very real. All right. And the immediate appeal to one great leader, if you get a good one, if you're lucky, or you get a really ruthless and cunning one, it just isn't after you. It might work out for you for a little while. But when they die, they rarely have built up institutions to maintain what they did. This is why demagoguery is such a threat. It's not because like institutions are great in and of themselves. Our institutions fucking suck. They're run by Nepo babies. They've moved from ascribed to meritocratic back to ascribed, which is basically like, you know, there is a way that like during the robber baron period, you could actually go from rags to riches. It's impossible effectively now. Pretty much everyone who's a millionaire was born a millionaire and has inheritances they're playing off of, and they don't know how to run anything. And they're 3 generations from the expertise that their evil overlord ancestors had. They're not even ruthlessly cunning. They're the Habsburg jaw of capitalism, right? You know how that jaw looks after a few generations. You just can't eat anymore. So, you know, we're seeing that. But that affects all of society. All right? This is why when people are like, oh, we just need a sovereign to fix stuff for us. So I'm like, the sovereign has a Habsburg jaw first, by the way. They're the most inbred, most isolated. And if you, like, even if you get a good one, you only usually get one. Then you don't have anyone with the expertise to run the system. I can't run all of society. Like every cook can govern, but I don't know how to do nuclear physics. Governing's pretty easily, by the way. Look at who we put in charge. It's like, I'm going to end on this anecdote. I recently rewatched the Brezhnev and Andropov speeches. Okay? Brezhnev looked spry compared to Trump, and Trump looked like a teenager compared to Joe Biden. I'm just going to put that out there for you. All right? Look, I was watching George W. Bush, a person that we made fun of, and who I think is basically the devil. I way hate him more than I hate Donald Trump. And yet, I was pretty shocked at how cogent he felt compared to what I see now. The great decider seems like an utter orator comparatively. Why is that? That's the great question you got to ask. And if you can't fix that, then we just need to watch it burn. I don't really have anything else to sell to you. I'm not a doomer. Like, I do think there's a future for human life. I don't hate people, and I don't have a lot of broke for people who do. But like, we can't lie about what we're producing right now. We see it in our leaders. It's all Habsburg jaw. There's barely any teeth left. They can barely, their tongue's like over here. Metaphorically speaking. It's a disaster. Yeah, Brezhnev was less being really old so much as being a terminal alcoholic. Well, I mean, and I'm not going to say that because I don't want to disparage good Russian people, but like, America didn't consume as much alcohol 10 years ago either. Just want to put that out there.
Before we go, I just want to say that I also hate George Bush. I just want that to be out there.
Oh yeah. If you're one of those liberals trying to recapitulate George Bush because he sounds cogent compared to what you have today, fuck you. Like, depending on how you do the math, he killed like 1 million people. In fact, I saw somebody put it up to 3 million indirectly from other things downstream of shit he did. All right. If you're going to put 1 million people on COVID because of Trump, you also got to put it on Joe Biden because they pretty much kept the same policies. Trump just like lied to anti-vaxxers to keep them on his coalition, which caused chaos. But he's actually the person who implemented half the policies that Joe Biden followed through on, except for the mandates. So that's a bipartisan death toll, my friends. So, you know, I just want to, don't get so nostalgic for the imperial past of 20 years ago where we were just ruthlessly killing everybody. Directly, not indirectly like now. Also didn't build anything. Don't get all weepy-eyed for Reagan because he's sundown with more grace than a plum. Don't get all weepy-eyed for Bill Clinton because he's younger than either of the two current presidents. Don't get all sad sack for Barack Obama because he could confound you by using big words. Or pretend that he wasn't part of an elite, which he absolutely was. And don't let the Democrats Louis Lightfoot you when they throw some nothing burger to replace Biden from the people who lost to Biden only 4 years ago when he was a spry 77. Jesus. This is not, I mean, like, I've been joking, but like, I think about all those mid-century satirists like Thomas Pynchon and Don DeLillo, and I'm like, you know what? You guys were cowards. You had no idea how stupid and bad it was going to actually get. Like, I read White Noise, and it kind of feels like that you're underdoing it.
Right. And I mean, actually, the disaster in East Palestine was worse than the scene in White Noise.
Yeah. Oh God. Yeah, it was. Oh man. And I just want to just remind you that we're going to have an economic miracle due to AI that's going to require double the power that we don't already have. I can't even make fun of this anymore. Every weird, cynical joke I make is not severe enough. That is all. Thank you, Julie. Thank you, John. Thank you, Phil, even though Phil's kind of quiet. For coming on and being the buffer between me and the audience so that I didn't just yell at them for 3 hours. Some of them like that. You guys should probably like.
I like that.
Okay. You can pay professionals for that, but I guess a lot of you do. So that's why you give me money. But really, in all seriousness, try to do something with this. I don't have big ambitions anymore. I mean, we can have them again later, but right now you just need to take stock of where you're really at and quit lying to yourself. And I see this to me too. All right. I got conned too. I let the social democrats tell me to be practical, that there was a movement, and that I was too cynical. And at the time, it felt good to believe in them. It really did. I didn't like when I got yelled at for saying you haven't thought about what's going to happen if Bernie wins and you don't have a Democratic Congress that's sympathetic to him. You know, but even that was too optimistic. And you see this today. I mean, I think about this right now. Starmer took a landslide win, whatever the fuck that means in the UK, for Labour, not because Labour won much. Really, they had less votes than they had than both Corbyn runs, but because they just let their enemy collapse themselves after exhausting. And by the way, it took 5 administrations of those fucking losers to do it. with Corbyn too. Just want you to think about how bad what that says about everybody in the left in the UK. And by the way, we're not a lot better. We didn't even get that far. And today, the progressive kissed the ring of a person who looks very likely to lose and whose donors are abandoning him en masse. And if you replace them, you know, let's say you get Kamala Harris or some contested convention where you Gerald Ford somebody, you got somebody who wasn't elected at all. I want you to remember that since we've started mentioning Kamala Harris, her pointage above Biden has subtracted. They're now about neck and neck. What do you think is going to happen when she's actually in everyone's limelight again? Years of expertise as a prosecutor is going to make you a good president? I really don't want to imagine cop in chief. I'd rather have general in chief, and I don't really want that. So have a good day. When you think about the fact that a lot of you on the Democratic Socialist or Social Democratic, I don't know what you want to call yourself today. I know that you think word order really changes something. I know I've alienated most of those people except for Ben Burgess, who I've been abusing since before he was famous, so I'm gonna get away with it. I've been having Ben Burgess say, I think we really agree for a long time. And I love Ben. For those of you who don't know, I really don't like all the Ben hate. You should go hate on someone who actually sucks. Ben is milquetoast, but he's fairly honest milquetoast at least. But my point is that beyond that, I really let those people convince me. I met with Michael Brooks. He had me singing this "We Can All Get Along" shit. And people get mad when I say, like, I don't know how he thought he was going to keep Amy Therese, The Gray Zone, me, Douglas Lane, Sam Cedar, Antifada, all these people who don't really share much of anything except that we hate capitalism and not and somewhat follow politics outside of the United States on the same team. But, you know, at the time, I got tired of feeling like I was telling everyone the sky was falling too. It gets old. When you say this, I mean, like, I know for a lot of people who are in my audience, you're like 22. This is new to you. I've been saying some of this stuff for over 12 years since Occupy happened, which even to me feels like a bajillion years ago. Anyway. If anyone's playing 12-dimensional chess, but they also seem drunk, you should probably assume that they're playing 12-dimensional chess drunk. And that doesn't usually work out well for you. I've tried it. Not good. Well, not 12. I got to 3-dimensional chess and I got mad and flipped the board over because I couldn't keep up with the moves. And maybe that explains a lot about my personality, but nonetheless. Okay, we're really gone this time. I really need to get a nap. I got to wake up in the morning and walk my dog because I'm a normal human being with a normal human life. And you should all do that too. Keep skilling yourself. I'm not saying that you should be apocalyptic because apocalypticism is a cope. You don't get out of it that easily. Usually, empires fall for a long time. I mean, even these fast ones. Some of them are still falling, even though they've, been falling. I mean, Britain, it took a century. The Roman Empire took like 7. Ming China took a while. I mean, just pick one. Look at it. It's going to be slow, and you might not even realize it's fallen until well after it already has. I think maybe we're going to look back at this time and go like, oh, this is like the Byzantine Empire shit. And the Turks are already over there. In fact, they're already here, maybe.
Sea peoples.
Yeah. The sea peoples, they've already intermixed with us anyway. All these can be used as very xenophobic metaphors, so we're going to stop that right now because I'm not actually afraid of invaders. I'm afraid of us. Like, if anyone's going to destroy the United States, we're damn well going to do it ourselves. God damn it. Usually that is the way this works. So on that note, I hope you all have a good night. Does Sam Cedar really understand capitalism? I have no idea. I mean, he's a comedian. He's made money. I'm more, you know who I'm actually more mad at? I'm mad at the people who complain about the Democratic Party and talk about how awful it is, but when you really push on them on breaking or bending something independent, they tell you you can't do it. And that's like 3/4 of the old dirtbag left and their current descendants. And to be fair with Sam Cedar, he's never pretended to be anything other than an Air America progressive. I never really thought they understood much of anything but Air America progressivism. I don't like go to Janine Garofalo for my political economy, and I never have. And if you feel like you need to get all your political analysis from mid-tier comedians, and I'm not just talking about Sam Cedar here, it's like across the board, then go ahead. I mean, every cook can govern, right? But I'm not sure everyone still remembers how to read. So on that note, I really am gone because I'm going to get in trouble. Goodbye.